In the span of 3 months, from the end of last year to the beginning of this year, the world witnessed two of the largest mass killings in modern history. One of these is probably already familiar to you. In just one weekend in January, Iran's security forces turned their weapons against protesters in various cities and towns across the country. Because of the ongoing blackout, it's hard to get the exact number. But it's estimated that between 7,000 and 35,000 people were killed, a speed and scale of killing that surpasses what happened in the Srebrenica massacre in 1995. In any case, the killing of protesters in Iran has caught the attention of the world. For better or worse, the Islamic Republic has never left the news since then. The same can't be said for another recent massacre. These are the most brutal events that coincided with the fall of al-Assir in Sudan, at the hands of the Paramilitary Rapid Support Forces, or RSF, in October of last year. Just like in Iran, it's almost impossible to get the exact number of those killed in Malaysia. At the lowest estimate, the UN said that 6,000 were killed in just 3 days. Meanwhile, according to a report in the British Parliament, the number of those killed reached 60,000. In the most extreme estimate, the executive director of Yale Research Labs told the New York Times that the number of those killed could be between 30,000 and 100,000 in 6 weeks, and that 60,000 is a reasonable middle figure. If proven, this highest figure would make the fall of Malaysia the most brutal event of this century, comparable only in speed and scale to the height of the Rwanda genocide. For comparison, it took nearly 21 months of bombing before the death toll in Gaza reached 60,000. But it seems that the Rapid Support Forces reached this number in just a tenth of that time. And yet, no matter how terrible this tragedy is, it seems to have disappeared from the headlines. At first, the world noticed it. The initial shock did not result in long-term action. And honestly, this is the story of the entire war in Sudan. A war that began exactly 3 years ago on April 15, 2023, and quickly became the worst conflict in the world. The data related to this is very hard to comprehend. It is estimated that 400,000 people have died and up to 14 million people have been forced to flee. And more than 60% of the population is experiencing severe food shortages. At some point, it becomes impossible for the average person to fully comprehend these numbers. So what our minds can only do is say, wow, this is really terrible, without really being able to process the full weight of the tragedy. And there are still many more we could mention. Entire cities that were destroyed and abandoned. Torture centers found in areas controlled by the RSF, where many civilians just suddenly disappear. Doctors Without Borders also reported widespread violence against women and girls in Darfur. A report documented at least 41 incidents involving RSF fighters and their allies, including abuse of children under 5 years old. We can also mention that El Fasher is not the first site of large-scale killings in this war. In 2023, it is estimated that between 10,000 and 15,000 people were killed in 2 separate brutal incidents in the city of El Geneina. And now there is a growing belief that the targeted killings by the RSF against ethnic groups such as the Masalit and Zaghawa in Darfur may be considered a genocide. At this point, you probably get the idea. The war in Sudan is on a different level compared to most modern conflicts. While the war in Ukraine has also caused a huge number of casualties, the difference is that except for the siege of Mariupol in the early weeks of the war, most of those killed in large numbers are soldiers and mercenaries. In Sudan, most of those who are dying are believed to be civilians. Among the wars in the 21st century, perhaps only the Tigray War can be compared to the intensity of this violence. But the purpose of this video is not to drown you in so many depressing statistics, although when it comes to Sudan, it's almost unavoidable. Instead, there are 3 things we want to do. First, to use our small platform here on YouTube to remind the world, on the 3rd anniversary of the war, that this conflict is still ongoing. Because for us, it's almost unbelievable that a tragedy of this scale is barely being noticed. Second, to give a brief background of the conflict for those who are hearing this story for the first time. And third, to answer a very important question. Why does it seem like so few people really care? Let's start with the basics of how this war began. At its core, this is a power struggle between two armed groups. Then,
the RSF that
led by the warlord Houthi and the Sudanese Armed Forces, SAF, which is currently under the leadership of General al-Burhan. The SAF is the official military of Sudan. The former dictator Omar al-Bashir was afraid to give too much power to the army. They might use it to overthrow him. That's why he established an alternative, the Rapid Support Forces. The RSF originated from the Janjaweed militias, who were responsible for the original genocide in Darfur in the early 2000s. Most of its members are nomadic Arab herders, although in 2025 they allied with the Nuba militia, who SPLMN, which is based in southern Sudan. The main support of the RSF still comes from the Arab tribes of Darfur. At the height of their power in 2010, they were not only used to crush rebellions within the country, but they were also sent on missions abroad. One of the most well-known was their participation in the campaign of Saudi Arabia and the UAE in Yemen, which made them a favorite of Abu Dhabi. But in reality, the main duty of the
RSF is
to serve as a counterbalance to the army, to ensure that the generals could never overthrow al-Bashir from power. That's why what happened next was filled with deep irony. Since this is just a brief overview, we won't go into all the details. But simply put, after decades of oppressive rule and a failing economy, the people rose up against al-Bashir in 2019. The dictator expected that the army would crush, or that the
RSF would
crush the revolution, but the opposite happened. Both
the SF and RSF sided with
the protesters and ousted him from power. After this, there was a brief hope that a power-sharing government would be formed where the SAF, RSF, and civilians would have positions. The plan was for this to serve as a temporary step towards full civilian rule. But since this is a story about civil war in Sudan and not about a transition to democracy, you probably already guessed what happened next. As the deadline for civilian rule approached, it was decided by
the SF and RSF that
it would be easier to govern if they were gone. So in 2021, they carried out a coup and removed them from power. Even though hope for democracy wasn't completely lost, the tensions began to rise between the army and the RSF, especially on the issue of how to integrate the
RSF into the
under military control. Despite several attempts at negotiation, it became clear that this was heading toward an armed conflict between General Burhan's forces and Hemeti's men. And on April 15, 2023, fighting broke out, right in the middle of the capital, Khartoum. Although it was expected that the SAF's control of air power would give them a quick, albeit bloody, victory, the RSF countered this by using air defense systems provided by the Wagner Group. Because of this, they neutralized the army's advantage in the air. After this, the RSF quickly captured the capital, forcing al-Burhan and the SAF leadership to flee to Port Sudan on the Red Sea coast. And this is where what could be the strongest began. And here, the strongest. And here, we haven't even mentioned the many other factors that are pushing the whole country toward collapse, such as the intense tension between, perhaps the strongest. We also haven't discussed the role of religion, where the RSF tries to present itself as a secular force compared to the SAF, which has connections to Islamism. However, I hope this is enough as an initial explanation so we can discuss the bigger and more important question now. Why is it that after 3 years of intense fighting, so few people seem to be paying attention? In the media and government statements, Sudan is mentioned less compared to Ukraine or Gaza. A 2024 study showed that the New York Times mentioned Ukraine 13 times. A report from the analytics firm Chartbeat said that on the first anniversary of the war, major news outlets published thousands of articles per month about Ukraine and Gaza. Meanwhile, Sudan only reached around 600 articles per month. This means that the gap is real, and it's also easy to explain why. One of the most common theories is racism. Those who may be killed in Sudan are often considered black in the West, even though their own identity may be different. According to those who believe in this theory, people in wealthy Western countries don't value the lives of Africans or black people as much, so they pay more attention to other places. But there is also a counter-argument to this. We have a lot of historical evidence showing that the West also cares about non-white people. For example, the original genocide in Darfur was also carried out by groups that later formed the RSF. And this might be the strongest point. This is likely when major aid from various countries began arriving. In fact, it was just ordinary Americans, not the government or institutions, who donated $1.4 billion to help a country where almost 95% of the population is black. And then there's Gaza, too. Although many seem to have forgotten now, some said back in 2022 that Ukraine was only getting attention because it was white people being killed. This is where the war in Ukraine began. The violence in Ukraine received widespread coverage around the world, but it also exposed blatant racism and bias in valuing or not valuing the lives of non-Europeans. If you only compare Ukraine and Sudan, it might seem like there's a point, but that comparison would be unfair because the war that has gotten the most attention this decade is one in which those dying are not white Europeans, but Palestinians. In short, there are many examples that contradict the idea that Sudan is being ignored by the world solely because of racism. It doesn't mean that racism doesn't play a role, but it might be an oversimplification to base everything on that alone. So now there are some possible explanations for why there is this attention gap. One of the most believable is the overwhelming, and it might have started as the strongest. And here, there is a clear good guy in Kiev and a bad guy in Moscow, while the situation in Sudan is chaotic, which might be the strongest. As we keep emphasizing, even when fighting for space, this is where it might have started, possibly the strongest. And a group that does bad things to women and girls, they might have started. It has been proven several times that X might have bombed civilian residences. Airstrikes hit crowded markets. This is where armed Islamist groups might have started who immediately executed hostages. Would you choose them over? This is where it might have started. But they absolved themselves in this fight of their own clear war crimes. And this is where it might have started.
And this is where the strongest might have started.
That means if you want to fully understand the war, you need a lot of background explanation. And this doesn't even include the role of foreign countries with their own interests. A well-known example is the UAE, which reportedly provides weapons and equipment to the RSF in exchange for gold from Sudan. There are other countries helping the RSF, such as Ethiopia, Chad, and eastern Libya under General Haftar. On the other hand, support is given to the
SAF by
Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and increasingly Somalia as well to make things even more chaotic. Some of these countries also have their own groups that side with the enemy. For example, the federal government of Ethiopia seems to be siding with the RSF, while some Tigrayan rebels in the north are fighting alongside the Sudanese military. Somalia, on the other hand, sides more with the SAF because they fear that RSF allies like Ethiopia are a threat to their territory. If you're confused by all of that, you're not alone. And this is one of the reasons why many people aren't interested in this war. It's hard to explain such a complicated situation to people who are already busy with so many other things. At some point, people just get tired and stop listening. Maybe just like how you felt in the previous part. And there's another possible reason. There's just too much happening in the world right now. Just think about it. In 2026 alone, there was a kidnapping of the president of Venezuela, a widespread crackdown on protesters in Iran. The United States threatened to annex Greenland. There was conflict between Pakistan and Afghanistan. Cartels shut down parts of Mexico. The US and Israel attacked Iran. And Israel occupied southern Lebanon while the war in Ukraine is still ongoing, along with other important events like the elections in Hungary. With so much going on, even people whose job is to follow this kind of news get exhausted too. For ordinary people who have to think about work, bills, and their personal lives, it's not surprising if they no longer have enough attention left for Sudan. But even if this is true, it doesn't fully explain why there's also a lack of action from diplomats and world leaders, the very people expected to respond to crises like this. Honestly, at the institutional level, the response to Sudan has been very weak. In the US, Donald Trump's administration appointed a former businessman, Mossad Boulos, to help end the war. According to Sudan expert Cameron Hudson, he is someone who is clearly unqualified for the position given to him. It's not surprising. It also wasn't effective. Boulos was also ineffective in negotiations, much like other negotiators have failed to end the war in Ukraine. Meanwhile, in Europe, they took what seemed to be an unusual step. A peace conference was held in Berlin, but the two main parties, the S, were not invited.
SAF and RSF.
All this deserves is a sarcastic round of applause. By the way, when it comes to the UK, the government refused to give the RSF a legal designation. It would have been a step that would put them in the same category as groups like Hezbollah, Wagner Group, and Palestine Action, where any kind of support for them would be considered a crime. This was done even though there were investigations by The Guardian that exposed RSF recruitment networks based in London, as well as high-level propagandists operating from cities like Sheffield. Another sarcastic round of applause for the UK. But this is not just a story of the failure of Western institutions. This is a failure on a global scale. The UN did nothing to stop the massacre in El Fasher, even though experts had been warning for months that the RSF might commit war crimes if they took over the city. The African Union also did almost nothing. There seemed to be no action in the face of a possible genocide happening right on their own continent. The so-called Quad Group, which is composed of the US, UAE, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia. The group leading the peace negotiations is barely functioning, especially as tensions between Riyadh and Abu Dhabi continue to escalate. And this is where one of the biggest problems in the attempt to achieve peace in Sudan comes in. Too many powerful countries have interests in this war for it to simply end. For the UAE, an RSF victory is important to their strategic plan in the Middle East and North Africa region, a plan in which they will support secular or non-Islamist forces. Because of this, Saudi Arabia and Egypt became even more determined to prevent the success of the RSF. As the clash between these two blocs intensifies, more countries are being drawn in. Israel and Ethiopia are getting closer to the UAE, while Turkey and Pakistan are siding with Saudi Arabia. This means that many powerful countries now have a stake in the outcome of the war in Sudan, and this makes any solution even more difficult. In an ideal world, there would be coordinated action to stop the UAE network that supplies the RSF. But in reality, America wants to maintain its alliance with the Gulf while European countries like France continue to sell weapons to Abu Dhabi. If you talk to leaders like President Macron or Marco Rubio, they'll probably say that the war in Sudan is terrible. But they'll also admit that this is not their main priority. For them, the Middle East is still more important compared to a civil war in the northeastern part of Africa. And in a sad way, this might be the answer to our question. Maybe the reason why few people care about Sudan is because many see it as not that important. As Neville Chamberlain once said, it is seen as a conflict in a faraway country between people they do not know. Of course, what Chamberlain was referring to back then Was the Sudetenland in 1938 an event that later turned into one of the biggest crises Britain ever faced? It doesn't mean that the war in Sudan will reach the level of World War III, but it would also be a huge mistake if the world continues to ignore it. What's happening in the Middle East shows that our world is interconnected, full of pressure points where even minor tensions can have an impact on the other side of the planet. For example, the closure of a narrow shipping lane in the Middle East can raise gas prices in the US or cause an LNG crisis in India. And Sudan is located next to one of the most important shipping routes in the world, the Red Sea. Now, the key countries in the Gulf and the Horn of Africa are becoming even more involved in this war, along with all the risks that come with it. In short, if the unrest in Sudan gets worse, it could have effects that go beyond their borders in ways we don't fully understand yet. It may be common now to ignore this war, but that doesn't mean we won't be affected by it someday. Thank you for watching.